since pro-Palestinian encampments started going up on college campuses across the country, many student protesters have been wary of the media, and not without reason. Historically, news coverage of protests generally has tended to be more sensational and simplified than comprehensive and nuanced. Now, several weeks into this round of protests, how are we, the media, doing? I'm joined now by Dan Lothian, executive producer of The World, produced here at GBH, and Lylah Alphonse, New Hampshire and Rhode Island editor for the Boston Globe and former managing editor of U.S. News and World Report. Lylah, let me start with you. Do you think when it comes to the volume of protest coverage that we are getting it right in terms of the amount? Are we covering it appropriately? Are we not covering them enough? Or are we maybe covering them a little bit too much?
I think that's actually a really tough question. So it depends on where you're looking. The media is not a monolith, so I think the way it's being treated digitally and in print is different from what you're seeing on TV. I think that the media in general, though, is inherently reactive in situations like this. So if it's big and loud and messy, it's going to get airtime, it's going to get pixels and ink. But I think overall we're paying attention, and that's really the most important part. I think it's very easy for people to dismiss encampments because they're tired of what's going on. They don't really understand the nuances of the topic that's being protested. They're confused seeing who's making up these protests. So I think overall the media needs to keep their eye on what's going on and keep explaining things.
We'll get into some of the points that you mentioned a little bit more momentarily. Dan, what's your take on the amount of coverage, for starters?
I do think, again, I agree with you that it is, depending on where you consume your news, you could argue that it's being overcovered or undercovered. It is important that this story is being told. So I think, to your point, any time that you can shine the light on young people getting engaged in a not only just the political process, but a global story and an issue, I think that's a good thing. Where I do think you might argue that it's being overcovered and then covered perhaps with the wrong view is across social media. And the reason for that is that people want to share the people getting shoved against something, being hit by something, chased away from something, police moving in with a line. And so those things are often shared without context. There's one quick line, "Can you believe this happened?" And so, and then that is, depending on what view and what side you're taking on this, that is what is shared. And I follow a lot of different news sites and I follow a lot of different people on Instagram. And that is where I notice that you see just a lot of coverage that isn't providing the kind of context, or you have to go digging somewhere to find the context for it.
If you want it.
If you want it. But most people don't. They just, and so this becomes the narrative that it's not so much about the message, but it's about the students against a university or students against the police.
There's a journalism professor at Michigan State who we had on Greater Boston earlier this week named Danielle Brown, and she argues that coverage of protests tends to focus too much on spectacle and confrontation and not enough specifically on the causes and grievances that are animating the protesters themselves. Do you think that's a fair critique?
I think that is fair. I agree with it. I was teaching a class not covering these kinds of protests, but just protests in general. And I said, the problem is we run into a protest, or some sort of activity on the street. We want to get as close to the action, and then you start running from that action because tear gas is being thrown or whatever it is, and then you become the story. I saw something recently where there was an anchor saying, okay, are you safe? And then, if you feel at any moment you're not safe, raise your hand. I'm not really sure what that would have done, but you're putting yourself in, right, so you then become the story. And what I have said in the classroom, speaking with students in the past, is that you need to be covering a protest before the protest happens. So we know these things are going to happen. You want to talk to people about the issues, right? You want to talk to more than just the police about what is expected to happen there, to really get the voices that understand what's happening, not just the emotional reaction in that moment.
And that's another point that I know Danielle Brown made in this piece that she wrote recently, is that there's a long run-up in which you can be doing exactly that kind of reporting, talking to people in advance, talking about what's motivating them, but that the media just quantitatively simply waits until it reaches a crisis crisis point. Lylah, there's been some criticism of the press for accepting the narrative that's been put forth by a lot of people, including New York Mayor Eric Adams, that the protesters are being driven by, quote-unquote, outside, or the protests are being driven by, quote-unquote, outside agitators. Let's take a look at a couple examples and then come back and talk about that.
Tell us about this change.
Yeah, so when we entered Hamilton Hall, this is not what students bring to school. Okay, this is what professionals bring to campuses and universities. These are heavy industrial chains that were locked with bike locks, and this is what we encountered on every door inside of Hamilton Hall.
I was at UCLA yesterday. They there have, 48,000 students, and again, we're talking about a couple hundred. So less than 1%.
And how many of them are actually students?
A lot of them are not students, so they conceal their faces entirely, so you can't even tell who's an outside agitator and who's an actual student.
It was subsequently noted on Twitter, now X, that in fact that chain that students allegedly would not bring onto campus, it's a bike lock that's available at a discount.
I was going to say, you can also buy chain at any hardware store.
Yeah.
And bike locks are also easily available.
So two related questions for you. Do you think it matters if non-students are participating in these campus-based protests? And if so, what should we call them?
Two good questions there. I think it does matter. I think that sometimes we focus on that because it's easy. We tend to think of college students as kids. They're not. They're adults. Graduate students are even older than freshmen and sophomores. They are fully capable of deciding to do things like this and executing on their plans. But I think that focusing on outside agitators allows us as parents, as journalists, to feel like our good kids would never do something like this. And it puts some distance between what's going on. It makes it easier to ignore consequences. I think it's important to note when there are outside agitators, but I also think that it's important to note that just in the clip you just showed, they attributed a lot of what's going on to outside agitators, then acknowledged that they can't tell who's who.
Right.
So what's their proof when they're talking about the sheer numbers? So I do think it's important to note, I think it would be good if we could figure out what organizations are supporting things. There are national organizations. Most organizations on campuses are part of a national organization of some part. So it's not unusual that outsiders, non-students would be involved, but I don't think it's right to assign all of the responsibility for what's happening and therefore all of the consequence to outsiders.
Well, I know it's something that many protesters take issue with, too, because it suggests that they don't have agency and are not, in fact, passionate about the cause that's being covered. Do you have a problem with the term outside agitators? Because I know historically it's often been used to delegitimize people who are working for social change. I think Martin Luther King was labeled an outside agitator, at least in some contexts.
I have a problem with terms, period, right? I think any time we fall into collectively using certain terms when we're covering certain kinds of stories, or we fall into parroting what we are told by law enforcement officials or other officials as well, then that's where we get into trouble. And so I think that the best way to avoid any of these issues around terms is just call it what it is, right? If people are protesting, it's protesters. If half of them are not, students and half of them are other people, you say half are students and half are X, right?
And I guess provide as much information as you can about the other people who are not students.
Exactly. You run into trouble anytime you start attaching labels because protests are never clean. It's never 100% of anything, right? And so you really just need to be very specific with what you are seeing and what you are calling it, as opposed to this using a name, outside agitators, or some other phrase. The other point I'd like to make is that, I think all of us as reporters have been covering protests since day one. I don't know that I've ever covered a protest where everybody there was with the group, at least once something gets big. If it's in a high school and they're protesting about teachers, maybe it's just all high school students on campus. But any major protest that happens, you always get a lot of other people who join. Sometimes it's because they believe in what you're doing and they want to support it, and other times they want to use the spotlight of that moment to get attention for something else. And so I don't think this is unusual. And so that's why, knowing that, with that knowledge, news organizations need to be smarter in the labels that they use around coverage of a story like this.
I think agitators is particularly inflammatory because it implies that they're just out there stirring the pot, that they're just wrecking things for the sake of wrecking things. They're just trying to get people angry.
Yep.
And
that's an excellent point, as opposed to having a genuine conviction that they're voicing.
Exactly. And I think that the people who are protesting now, students and community members and organizers, all have concerns that they are trying to air.
I want to ask you both, before we wrap up, about a poll that came out this week from Axios. They polled college students nationwide. They asked them about 9 different topics and how concerned they were about those topics. One of them was the conflict currently going on between Israel and Hamas, and that ranked at the bottom of the 9 topics that the students were asked about. That poll also found that just 8% of college students had participated in any type of protest, whether it was pro-Palestinian, pro-Israeli, something else. Might those numbers suggest that we pull back a bit moving forward when it comes to covering these, or is 8% a significant enough number, and is the issue important enough that that in fact we should keep on covering it the way we have been?
I don't think we shouldn't drive our coverage based on poll numbers. I do think it's good to put it in context, right? So if you are covering this and you're giving either through the repetition of the coverage of something or through just the promo material that you use around it, you have to make sure that you're giving the full context. That yes, there are students doing this, but there are other students who just want to graduate and want to go on with their lives. I think that is important to know. But I don't think that we should ever look at, oh, this is a small thing that's happening, and so therefore it shouldn't be something that we stay on the story. I think a lot of big stories that we cover don't affect thousands of people, and they're still important for us to cover it. So we shouldn't be guided by polls, but it certainly should give us it should be something that we look at and use that to make sure that we are giving a broader spectrum of coverage around it.
Lylah, you got the last word here. Do you agree with Dan?
I say this about political polls, and I'll say this about this one as well. Polls are snapshots in time. They're a small, relatively speaking, group of people who respond, and then that response is extrapolated to apply to a large group of people.
That's a good reminder.
So Axios, 8% of respondents have been involved in a protest. That doesn't mean it's 8% of the student body across America. I also think that we're focusing a lot on elite institutions in places where kids are rushing off, or I said kids again, students.
It's an easy, I have the same habit.
Are rushing off to make third shift because they have to pay their mortgage or pick their kids up from school. They're not the ones who are in these encampments, by and large. Does that mean their points of view on this don't exist? No, they still exist. But I think that the protests could also represent people who are not able to be or privileged enough to be skipping classes or exams or stopping projects to sit in an encampment. So it's worth covering.
All right. Lylah Alphonse, Dan Lothian, thank you both for talking this through.
My pleasure.